Okay, so let's look at some of the changes that take place in, for example, wheat and barley as a result of domestication, and also as an archaeologist, how you would be able to recognize domesticated wheat versus wild wheat in an archaeological site. Okay, well, over here we have two types of barley. Both of these are barley. One is wild and one is domesticated. As you can probably guess, this is the domesticated version of barley. This is the wild version of barley. One of the changes that humans produced through selection was a barley plant that had larger seeds. Larger seeds, more food. Again, this is selection of traits where humans were actually selecting the genes to produce larger seeds. Another important change had to do with the attachment of the seed to the stalk. This is called a rachis. And you might think, well, what would humans want? A tough rachis or a brittle rachis? What would be more beneficial? Well, you could sort of imagine as people are harvesting, and this is an archaeologist using an age-old sickle showing how it would be done. That if you're harvesting wheat and you're kind of hitting the stalks here with your sickle, if this was a brittle rachis, these seeds would fall off right on the ground, and that would not be what you wanted. In the wild, though, that would be beneficial to the plant. The wind blowing through the barley would scatter the seeds. So humans selected for a tougher rachis so that the seed would stay firmly on the stalk until they got it back to their village. Humans also produced 6-road barley as opposed to 2-road barley. So in general, domesticated barley and wheat have a tough rachis, larger seeds, and the shell on the kernels here is typically softer than the wild version. Okay, well, let's look at the animals now. And as we were talking about before, it's important to sort of recognize, which animals were domesticated, which animals were not domesticated. When you watch the Guns, Germs, and Steel video by Jared Diamond, he talks a little bit about which animals have been domesticated, which animals have not been domesticated. Here you can see these are some nomadic herders in Iran, and they've got a number of different domesticated animals that they live off of. Sheep, goat. They also have some donkey. I think there's a couple of horses in there. In the Middle East, the first animals that were domesticated were sheep, goat, cattle, and pig. Those were the earliest domesticated animals in the Middle East, in the PPNB. Later, you had domesticated camels, donkeys, and horses. Right? That was thousands of years after that point. Those were some of the main animals in the Middle East. So sheep, goat, cattle, pig, later donkey, horses, and camels. Those are some of the animals that were domesticated. What are some other animals that have been domesticated? Well, chickens were domesticated in Southeast Asia. Right? You might think we're going to talk a little bit about turkeys were domesticated in North America. Right? Those are some of the main domesticated animals that we're familiar with. Which animals have never been domesticated? Well, we talked about tigers before. Animals like that. Lions, tigers, bears, never been domesticated. White-tailed deer, never been domesticated. Gazelle or antelope, never been domesticated. Zebra, never been domesticated. Elephants, never been domesticated. Right, so what do the animals that have been domesticated, what do they share that makes them suitable or easier to domesticate? Right? Well, one thing they typically share is being herbivores. Obviously, dogs are not, cats are not, but they're scavengers, so they're not going to compete with you for food resources. But typically, the best kinds of animals to domesticate are herbivores because they'll eat grass. They're not competing with you for food. What else do they have in common? Well, when you think about horses, like wild horses, sheep, goat, cattle, what is their herd structure like as compared to, let's say, tigers? Tigers are solitary, whereas horses, sheep, goat, those are all herd animals. Herd animals naturally want to be together in large groups. That makes them much easier to domesticate because you have a large population to select from. Which animals are going to live, which animals are going to breed, which animals are not going to breed. If you have, animals that don't want to actually be together in large groups, it's much harder to keep them in large groups. So the best animals to domesticate are herd animals that are herbivorous. And almost all of the domesticated animals in the ancient world fit this description, right? Cats and dogs obviously are an exception, but almost all the others are herd herbivores. So solitary carnivores would be some of the most challenging animals to domesticate. And some of these other animals, even though a zebra is a herd herbivore, it's much too skittish. It's very difficult to control. So that's why it was never domesticated. Okay, so let's look at some animal bones. If you were an archaeologist, you would find bones like these. Now, you can see that this section, this bone, is equivalent to this section of this bone. This is obviously a much bigger animal than this, but both are adults. How can you tell that both are adults? Well, if they were not adults, then this area of the bone down at the epiphyses would not be fused, right? That is, this section would be a separate piece of bone in a juvenile or young animal. Our bones, just like animals or other animals, fuse at different ages. This is one way you could tell from a bone whether an animal is an adult or not. You can see the same thing here, right? These are both adults because the bones at the ends of the bone have fused. This is cattle. Now, what do you think is the domesticated cattle? The smaller cattle is the domesticated version. The larger one is the wild version. So reduction in size is a very good, clear indication as an archaeologist that what you've excavated is a domesticated version. If you find a full adult, but it's half the size of a wild goat or sheep, you can know with pretty good certainty that it's a domesticated version of that animal. You could also use different bones to tell the age of the animal. We're going to see that this becomes important as well. Now here, this is a smaller jaw, but it is actually a younger animal because the molars have not all erupted here. Here you can see all of the teeth have erupted. This is the way archaeologists can tell the different ages of animals. So this gives you an idea of some of the earliest wild cattle in Europe and compared to a size of the earliest domesticated cattle in Europe. Right? So you can see a real difference in size. I think it's almost like more than half, less than half the size of the wild animal. Again, so here's cattle. This is pig, right? So the wild pig and the domesticated pig. You can see that the molars have erupted. These are the same age. This is a much smaller animal. This is a domesticated pig. Capra, goat. So here's the wild goat. Here's the domesticated goat. The domesticated goat is smaller than the wild goat. Okay, other changes that occur. In wild goats, you have very long scimitar-shaped horns. In domesticated goats, you have much shorter, twisted horns. We don't know if this was a deliberate selection by humans or if it just happened to coincide with other changes. But obviously in the wild, these large horns would be an advantage to a goat. To scare off predators, to be used for mate competition. But they would be a disadvantage in a controlled herd by humans because you would be using a lot of energy to keep up these appendages. Humans may not want them. And so over time, what you see is that the horns of the goat become shorter and twisted. And even though this outer casing, the actual horn, can be removed and be missing from the skull of an animal, what's left is the bone inside. So these are actual bone cores from an archaeological site in Turkey, and you can see the twist in the horn. That is a clear indication that these are from domesticated goats. Okay, what's another piece of evidence? You can have something that we would call culling patterns. Culling patterns are, when you cull the herd, you selectively kill off certain animals, right? Now, if people are controlling a herd and selectively killing off certain kinds of animals, it shows that they are controlling the herd. If they're using those animals for different purposes, you're going to get a different pattern in the population of the animals. So let's look at kind of an example. Imagine you had a graph, right? So I'll just draw a not very good graph over here, right? And pretend that this is, on the y-axis, the percentage of the population that remains. Over here, you have the different ages of the animal. Right? So an archaeologist would look at the bones, let's say, from all the goats at the archaeological site and say, 10% were killed off at age 1, 20% were killed off at age 2, etc., etc. You could create a profile that starts with 100% of the population until all the animals are dead, figuring out what ages most of the animals are dying off. And this would show what they might have been used for. Right, so imagine you have a situation where people are using them mainly for meat. You've got sheep, and people mainly want to use the sheep for meat. They're maximizing the use of the herd for meat. Well, when would you kill off the animal? You wouldn't kill them off very young because they haven't grown to full size. And you wouldn't kill them off when they're very old because the meat wouldn't be as good. It wouldn't be good quality. You would kill them off when they reached adulthood. They've reached maximum size, and the meat is still of good quality. So the way this would look is you'd kind of have a little bit of a drop until you reached about 1.5 years old. Then you'd have a much steeper drop, but you wouldn't kill off all the animals, of course, because then you won't have any animals the next generation. So you'd keep the rest around, and they would reproduce and slowly die off. So this is what it would look like if you're using animals for meat. Well, what about milk? Well, if you're using them for milk, some of the herd is actually going to be competing with you for milk. Those are the young animals. Now, of the young animals, you don't want to kill off all the young animals because then you won't have a herd anymore. But which young animals are the most important to you? That would be the females, because you don't need that many males to keep the population going, but you do need a lot of females. Right? So if you're using them mainly for milk, you would see a sharp drop early on as they would kill off a lot of young males. Then they would keep the rest of the population going. Like so. So that's what it would look like for milk. Now, what about if you're using them mainly for wool? You didn't eat the animals at all. You raised them for wool to use for textile production. Well, then there's no reason to kill the animals off at all, and you would just have kind of a very, very gradual kill off like that. These culling patterns tell you if a herd is domesticated or not. So again, this is much nicer than I did again, right? You can see milk, meat, and wool. Now, if you had to guess, they've actually done this archaeologically. They've looked at animal bones from early agricultural sites from the PPNA and the PPNB in the Middle East, trying to figure out why did people domesticate animals in the first place? What was the main use of the animals? Was it milk, meat, or wool? If you guess meat, you're correct. Right? The main incentive to domesticate sheep, goat, cattle, and pig was to have a ready supply of meat on hand. Okay, what's another piece of evidence of domestication? Another piece would be, what if you're studying an archaeological site that has animal bones, and those animals don't live in the wild in that region of the Middle East? Well, people probably brought them to that area, and that's probably a good indication that they were domestic as well. Right? Okay, so for domestication for animals, we've got a decrease in size, the horns becoming twisted, a culling pattern that shows that that they're using them for a specific purpose, right? And animals occurring outside of where they naturally live. All right, now let's look at another site. This is a very interesting site, but this site is not in this region that we were looking at before. right? It's actually found in a region. Let me just stop this for a minute. A region of Turkey over here. So we were looking at the Eastern Mediterranean. Now we're going to look at Turkey at a site called Çatalhöyük. Huyuk is the Turkish word for tell. Right? It's the same kind of terminology. This mound, that mound. In this case, çatal is fork, like a fork you would have on your dinner table. Forked mound. This mound is split in two, so modern people just named it the forked mound. We don't know what ancient people called it, but we know that back in the Neolithic, this site was in an area that was much wetter than it is today. Right, so what makes Çatalhöyük so interesting? Well, as a Neolithic site, it was based on domesticated animals and domesticated plants. It was a larger site than most Neolithic sites. But another thing that makes it interesting is the architecture. Right, when you look at the mud brick structures here, what you'll see is there's not many streets, and there aren't many streets in Çatalhöyük. So how did people get around? Well, they would walk up on ladders onto their roofs, and they would use the roofs in order to navigate from one house to the other. Why would they do this? Well, there's a couple of reasons, possibilities here. One idea is that it was for defense from outsiders, but there's no evidence for warfare at this time period in Çatalhöyük. There's not a lot of weapons or skulls that show evidence of violence. So it's doubtful that they were building the houses like this for protection against people. They might have been building it for protection against floods. That's another idea. And one I think is a little bit more on target. Okay, another thing that makes Çatalhöyük interesting is the kinds of burials that we find here, and also the paintings on the walls of certain houses called shrines. Now, in some of these shrines, we're going to see you have paintings. One of the paintings shows birds, looks like eating human corpses. Right? These are most likely vultures. And what might be depicted here is a certain process of burial that we still see in some communities in the world today. In parts of Tibet and Nepal, you find a type of burial called sky burial, where the person's body is laid out and exposed, and the vultures consume the flesh, which allows the soul to sort of emerge out of the body and rise up. And this is not a dishonorable way to be treated. In fact, it's a very honorable way of treating the dead. And it might have been going on in Çatalhöyük. And then the dead would be buried underneath house floors, either individually or sometimes in groups. Based on the paintings of Çatalhöyük, this is the kind of clothing styles that people had at that time. Kind of looks like punk rock to me. This is a group burial, so when someone would die, they would remove a section of the floor, bury that person, cover it up. If someone dies a few years later, they would remove that material again and place the next individual on top of the other individual, or they would bury them singly in pits. So one of the things that they find in the burials at Çatalhöyük is that men and women are buried with different things, but there's nothing to indicate that men and women have different statuses in terms of one being higher than the other. It looks like they're pretty much equal in terms of status, but they have different roles in the society, and different roles doesn't equate to status, right? So this is a female burial, and what she has here is a mirror made out of a special substance that exists right in the region of Çatalhöyük. This substance is something called obsidian. Obsidian is a natural volcanic glass. It's found in only select areas of the world, and in the Middle East, it's found in only two areas, near Çatalhöyük and this part of eastern Turkey over here. Now, because obsidian is chemically different depending on what source you're looking at, you can tell if obsidian found in an archaeological site, you can tell where it comes from. There's obsidian from Çatalhöyük found all the way in Jericho, down here. This is one of the earliest widely traded goods in the world. And so the Obsidian trade represents one of the early trading networks in the world. Well, how did they trade the Obsidian? It's very unlikely that people came all the way up from Jericho to Çatalhöyük and traded for Obsidian and brought all the way down. And it's very unlikely that people from Çatalhöyük went all the way down and traded it and then went back up. What most likely happened, what the evidence tells us, is that Çatalhöyük traded Obsidian to nearby villages. Those villages traded it to nearby villages, and they kept some. Then they traded some and kept some, traded some and kept some. So as you get further away from Çatalhöyük, the less Obsidian you find in these sites. And in fact, the amount of Obsidian at Jericho is very small. It's really just a few tools, because by the time the Obsidian made its all the way down, it had gone through so many intermediary villages, there wasn't that much left. But this made Çatalhöyük a very important site. It had a commodity that lots of other people wanted, and it made it kind of powerful, sort of an economically powerful site in a way, because it was able to trade this important resource. Another thing that made Çatalhöyük interesting, again, were these shrines. Shrines are religious structures that are found inside of people's homes, right? So special rooms inside people's homes. These are highly decorated rooms that would be found, let's say, in a large household of a family group or a kin group. And the decorations on the shrines give us some insight into the religion of the people of Çatalhöyük. So this is the original excavator you can see here, excavating some of the painting from the shrines at Çatalhöyük. There's those vultures we saw before. Some of the patterns are geometric. A lot of them depict certain kinds of animals. These are leopards, right? Wild animals. Almost all the animals depicted on the shrines are wild. There's another leopard. This is the depiction of a volcano, right? Remember, Obsidian's a volcanic rock. Çatalhöyük was near a volcano. It was in a volcanic region. Here's a wild bull, not drawn to scale by the ancient people, being hunted by, you can see the people of Çatalhöyük. Here's another hunting scene, wild deer. So bulls specifically were very important in Çatalhöyük. They took skulls from bulls and put plaster on them, plastered them on the walls of the shrines. They painted pictures of the bulls. They had bulls' horns that were used for some of these benches that were in the shrines. Right? So we see lots of wild animals, especially wild bulls. Wild bulls in many religions in many areas of the world tends to symbolize male fertility. Right? Now, one of the interesting things is, what animals are the people eating? Are they eating lots of wild bull? Are they eating lots of leopard? No, they're eating sheep and goat. The animals that are important in their diet are not the animals that are important in their religion. It's the wild animals that are important in their religion. They also find female figurines that we've said before probably represent fertility. So in general, their religion was most likely based on fertility, male fertility, female fertility, and the worship of fertility. The religion in Jericho and Ein Ghazal was based on the worship of ancestors. So it's a very different religion. It shows that in the Neolithic in the Middle East, you had different cultures developing in different parts. Okay, well, this is where we're going to stop in our discussion of origins of agriculture in the Middle East. And this will be the material for our first week. Please remember to take a look at that Guns, Germs, and Steel documentary. Next week, we'll be starting domestication and agriculture in Europe. I'm going to have a little bit of a short reading for you to do to get a little bit of a background on it. And it will be similar format to what we did this week. Please let me know if you have any questions as you're watching these films. I'm going to try and have kind of like office hour sort of thing on Blackboard. But until then, until I figure that out, send me any questions you have, and maybe we can have also like a frequently asked questions page on Blackboard where I can post some of these questions just in case people have the same question. So have a good week, and I will talk to you soon.